It's the old made new again, and the topsoil slotting plate is a bit of a twist on the old, and that's the new. It's a bit like we've just found Dad's old denim jacket in the back of the cupboard. We're going to drag it out, brought it out into the light. It still looks pretty good. Still does the job it was originally. Only now, instead of perhaps badges of the Saints or Sex Pistols, you've got badges of the Smith Street Band or Mumford and Sons, if you're that way inclined. So, my name is Wayne Parker. I'm a research officer with the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. I'm based in Geraldton. I've been researching incorporation of topsoil and lime in particular for the last 5 years, and focusing a lot of that research on the northern wheat belt of WA. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the work that's been conducted throughout the state, and part of the conversation will be around deep ripping, the responses that we see from deep ripping, the use of that topsoil slotting plate. Sort of going to introduce that to you if you're unfamiliar with it, but I'm also going to talk about just what it is that it does, and show you some of the results that we've seen, because we need to remember that when we're deep ripping, it's probably best that we're going back onto those paddocks and controlling our traffic. Otherwise, we undo all that work that the deep rip has done for us. So, if you've got your lunch and you're comfortable, we're going to make a start with our first slide. And this is it. What you're looking at there is a deep ripper specifically designed for trials ripping. Some of you may have already seen this, but there's 3 features on this machine that I need to make you aware of that make it a little bit different. The first of which, I'm going to highlight just these tines at the front here, and you can see those. Anyone who's familiar with the Grizzly deep delver would recognise those tines, and they'd be right, because that's exactly what they've come from. These tines are a leading tine. They enter the soil first. These tines are ripping, and they're shallow, so they're shallow leading tine. They're only ripping to about 300 mils or thereabouts, and they act as a in the fact that they are leading, they act as a bit of an ease for the following tines. And the following tines are ripping to 600 mils, or they've got the capacity to rip to 600 mils. And it's from purely by the fact that we've got our front tine, our shallow leading tine, breaking up that soil and letting it go through first, that we're able to achieve with this tine a depth of 600. On the back of that, and not to be left out of the equation, is this crumble roller. That roller is necessary for paddock levelling, because on the rear tine, as you've probably noticed, you'll see the topsoil slotting plate, and it's this little piece of equipment that changes the face of ripping as we used to know it. That plate, what it is doing is holding open the soil, which is loosened by the tine, to hold open a slot that allows topsoil to fall in behind. So we're getting all of the nutrients, the organic matter, whatever, the lime in a lot of cases, that has already been spread over the soil to fall down in between that slot that's been held open by the plates. So these are working below the surface of the soil and collecting whatever falls down behind. It's a fairly passive form of soil amelioration. We're not mixing it up. We're not mixing it through with a heavy spray. We're not turning it over. with an expensive moldboard. We're not leaving the soil bare either, because we are only opening a small slot, and as I say, it's a fairly passive way of incorporating our topsoil and getting it to depth. Need to just understand a little bit about how deep ripping works, and this image that you're looking at here is the front on view. As we move left to right, the front on view looking at a ripping tine as it's driving towards us. And as you can see, we start on our left side, the point of that tine is fracturing that soil and piercing through, and then as it comes through, it's lifting that soil and it's causing these fracture panes upwards, so it's lifting that soil, and then as that soil falls off the back of the tine, it's dropping it, so you're getting more fracturing. But what you're seeing is a V-shaped fracture that that is your breakout profile. Now we can alter that breakout profile in a number of ways, but what we generally see is something that might look a little bit like this under the soil, depending on your soil type and the implement that you're using. But that breakout is that breakout and fracturing of the V is important, because that's where our topsoil is going to be falling into. If I just chuck the topsoil slotting plates on the back of those tines as you see them, you can see that soil heave that's lifted up in front of the tine, mounted up. These plates are working below the surface, up to 10 centimetres or so below the surface. Naturally gravity fed topsoil down and into behind the ripping tine. What does that look like in the soil? And here we have two examples of two sands. On our left, this sand is a very deep, gutless white sand. It's often poor performing. The main constraint within this soil is its soil compaction. There's no pH barrier in there. It's also a bit non-wetting. It has been ripped to 700 mils, and it does have a this implement. It was a Grizzly heli ripper. It did have topsoil slotting plates on, and you can see that dark line of organic matter dropped in behind the slots, which is exactly how we'd like to see it working. It's not always going to be that same shape or pattern because of the nature of how it's falling in down behind those tines. This soil on the right, it's a yellow loamy soil. It does have pH issues or barriers at depth, so getting organic matter and lime into that layer is going to be beneficial for root growth, even without having the fracturing of the soil and easing the path of the roots. You can see this soil here was the conditions for during ripping and topsoil slotting were perfect. We had a moist soil, not a wet soil, but it was moist. It allowed the tine to penetrate and be able to be pulled. But on the surface soil is quite dry and therefore flows quite evenly and easily down behind into those topsoil slotting plates. Okay, so that's some of the logistics or some of how it looks in the field. And what does that actually mean for us when it comes to deep ripping results and yield? I'm going to take you down to Ongerup in the state south, and look at this particular soil type. The deep ripper was put into this one. There is a hard pan in this soil starting at 300 mils. It's a sandy clay duplex, and it has increasing clay content with depth, such that when the trial was ripped, we could only rip to about 450. We weren't able to get it in any deeper without, one, breaking something, or two, pulling up the tractor. And once we get below 300 mils, the soil's quite sodic. It's dispersive, has a high sodium concentration, and it's generally not a soil that we would advise ripping because of this. However, the ripper went into it, and these are some of the results that we've seen from it. In 2016, so the ripping, I just need to clarify a couple of things about this trial. The ripping was undertaken in 2015. This grower is in a CTF system. What we're looking at is how long can we maintain our ripping effect, and the addition of the topsoil slotting plates. And in this trial, we have chicken manure. The chicken manure is there for its organic carbon. We were trying to lift the organic carbon content because naturally they're very low in our weathered soil types, and we get that organic carbon into depth, provides a fuel source for microbes, it promotes a little bit of growth, and the thinking is that with that growth in our subsoils, we're able to hold those soils open a little bit more. We get a little bit more root exploration, the roots and the organic matter and the soil biota, holding that soil open for a little bit longer and improving how long we see a yield response from our deep ripping. And so this is what it looks like at this site. As I said, it's probably not a site that we would recommend ripping, only we're perhaps revisiting our recommendations with in the light of these results. In 2016, so this was ripped in 2015, at the end of 2016, which was particularly wet at this site, part of the site was underwater for some of the season, ripping has had a clear benefit. However, the variability in our results are such that in spite of achieving, 25%, nearly 25% more in our ripping to 300 over a year, we're still not really confident. The only figure that we're quite confident in what we saw from that site was that where we hadn't top dressed anything and we had ripped the soil to 450 with additional topsoil slotting plates. So this one here. And that gave us a 38% response over our nil, which was 2.7. Fairly beneficial to have the topsoil slotting plates at this site. Our thinking is that a lot of that yield boost has been provided in the topsoil slotting result, has been provided by the organic matter inclusion. That inclusion provides a buffer to some of that sodicity at depth, and so you're not having that that sodium concentration and droughting out of the roots. What you've got is a soil that has some of that buffering capacity. It's a bit easy to explore for roots. The ripping itself has provided drainage. I mentioned that the site was partly underwater, so combining that with the topsoil slotting plates has seen our buffering that sodicity and an improved yield. If we go to the other end of the state and we head right up north to Binu and to a completely different soil type, a yellow loamy sand. This is a sand somewhat particular to the Midwest, Mengenue and Mora and Binu. This soil has pH of about 4.5 in the subsoil. The aluminium at this site is not constraining. The biggest constraint to plant growth or activity at this site is our compaction layer, which is compacted to 450 millimeters. And so the ripper has gone through this one, and we're looking at our first year of results from 2015 here. The ripper's gone through, and we've made sure that that ripper has got underneath the compaction layer, so we've broken that soil right out and made it available for roots to access. And so that meant a ripping depth of 550 mils. What you may notice initially is our negative responses to ripping at 300, where we've had no top dressing and we've added 5 tonnes of lime sand. 2015 finished quite sharply. There were a number of consecutive days of over 35 degrees in early September at this site, and so any plants that didn't have access to depth or moisture, they simply hayed off, and as a result the yield that we saw was pretty negative in those ripped 300s, which is basically saying that sharp finish, the roots weren't deep enough. Ripping to 300 itself wasn't good enough to get a yield response, and has actually penalised us in that season. Having said that, looking at our ripping below the compaction layer, we've certainly had some very big responses in our wheat of that year, to the point where we've got nearly a tonne over and above our nil yield of 1.9, where we've gone to 550 and we've included topsoil sliding plates. The story was a little different in 2016 when it was in lupins, and it was somewhat reversed. I'm not showing those results today. However, in 2017 we're still seeing some positive response to that ripping that was conducted in 2015. The site itself at Binu in 2017 did suffer quite a lot from early season drought. We had a low plant emergence, and then when we finally got some rain and we thought we might get some yield, it was smashed by hail. So we're being a little bit cautious with how we present the data from that we get from that one in this year. However, still seeing positive responses to that from that site in 2017, and watch this space for some of those results. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on some of the things that the plate we need to be aware of when we do have topsoil sliding plates, and that is what its potential for recompaction might be. Because as you remember, if I took you back to that initial slide with this one, our topsoil slotting plates are forcing their way through this broken or lighter soil, and the forces that these plates put on the walls of that rip are possibly recompacting it. Okay, skipped a little bit there. So what we're looking at here is a measure of soil strength, simple penetrometer measurements. Across the top we've got our measures of soil strength, anything over 2000, and we're seeing a reduction in our root growth rate of about 45%. Once we get anything to 3,500 kilopascals, anything there or above, we've pretty much stopped all our root growth and nothing can get through unless it's following root balls. This is what we're at Binu here, at that site I showed you, and we're in the swale of a dune, and this is what it looks like where there's no ripping. And as we said, there is a compaction layer right down here to 450 where our roots are being really slowed up and impaired. We run a ripper through that at 300 and we break it out to 300. Our roots are still quite impaired below that depth. At 550, where we've got right down to below that that constraint with that hard pan, we've got a very light, loose, fluffy soil. Now, if that is direct, that measurement there, the red line, is taken directly from behind the tine, the ripping tine. Now, as you move off that tine and you continue to take measurements, what you see is the impact of the topsoil slotting plates on them, and you see an average soil strength increase at much shallower depths, at those depths that the topsoil slotting plate's working. Now, that's something we need to be aware of and fairly considerate when we're making recommendations to growers about topsoil slotting plates. They do provide a lot of benefit. However, we need to be aware that this may be happening, particularly on a sandy soil, and those soils at Binu we've seen this, and also at Mora, very similar pattern. Both of these soils have clay contents in the subsoil of less than 15%. However, if we increase the clay content at depth to 25–30%, like we see here at Meriden, this is a sandy clay loam, and what you're looking at here are some rip runs that Glenn Reithmuller and I did to investigate the draft forces with the topsoil slotting plates put on. This is the breakout profile, and what I'll get you to look at or concentrate more on is just this rise here in the profile meter. As you can see, this is the rip zone or the rip profile, the breakout profile, where we've got no plates. So this is just 2 ripper tines being dragged through that sandy clay loam at Meriden, and that's the breakout you see. We put the topsoil slotting plates on, and you can see that that rise there is much diminished. So the plates themselves in this instance have contributed to that breakout of soil. I think there's a little bit more work for us to investigate here. Certainly don't have any hard or fast rules as to which soil types are better for breakout with compaction plates or not. And this is just a first look, but I thought I'd make you aware that, you know, what we've seen at that site is possibly because of the soil conditions at the time of ripping, with the addition of those topsoil slotting plates, improving our breakout. Now I'm just going to finalise quick summary. Those topsoil slotting plates do provide us additional yield. They are also providing us access to sodic soils, which we've seen across 2 other sites, as well as that one at Ongerup. However, we need to be aware that it's possible that it's providing some recompaction on sandy soils, and we're still to investigate just what's happening on those higher clay soils. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Just going to have a look at some questions if there's any questions here. If you could just give me a second. If you've got any questions, chuck them in the question box. Glenn, the lupins at Binu showed negative response to topsoil slotting. There's a number of reasons for that, some of which we consider possibly the extraction of too much P. Also, these lupins did put on, in those topsoil slotting plates, did put on a lot of biomass, and lupins, when they do that, tend to put more biomass on than pods, and so what we saw was those pods not developing on those bulkier, more responsive sites, so they were confined to the topsoil slotting plates. And Paul, the hail problems were at Binu. That happened, I think it was sometime in August, just when we thought we were going to get about 800 kilos to the hectare maybe from some of the better spots in that paddock. Hail's come through and smashed grain out of heads, and yeah, made assessment of the site a little bit tricky. Okay. So we're looking at, Jackie's asked a question, do you know how much yield increase was due to ripping effect and how much due to redistribution of nutrients? The majority of that ripping response that we're seeing has come from the ripping effect. The redistribution of nutrients we haven't investigated very well, but it's fairly common to see a ripping response in the order of 30% year after year, I mean in the year of ripping, which then degrades over time, and our response to ripping is up to and including 9 years on a loamy sand, particularly when we're in a CTF system. So I've got a question regarding just how much additional horsepower is required for inclusion plates. The work that Glenn and I did and the initial view of the draft results from Meriden, just with those two tines on, showed us that the draft increased by 20% with the addition of those topsoil sliding plates just on those two tines. So as we increase our number of tines and the depth we try and rip to, topsoil sliding plates become a much more difficult piece of equipment to pull. Yeah. Okay. I think I've got one more question, and before I wrap it up. I have a question about the proportion of growers and their awareness on management of recompaction of rip paddocks. Has the proportion of growers able to manage this changed, and how might it change in the future? It's a great question, Jackie, because I think the awareness within the grower community is much greater about the impact that that vehicles have on their soil, and most growers are looking to have a plan to move towards CTF as they change over machineries from now into the future. That might be a 5-7 year plan, but there's certainly a lot more growers looking at how they might move to CTF, because they certainly understand. They can simply see the yield responses that the deep ripping is providing, and as we go deeper, it's certainly a whole lot more difficult to get traffic on that. On those paddocks, so unless they're looking at CTF, then some of that deeper ripping they won't be able to do. Thank you everybody for your participation today. I am going to call the webinar to a close there. A video recording of this webinar will be made available via YouTube in the coming days, and if you like, you can forward that on to those who were unable to make it today. So thank you very much, and that's where I close it.